Today we're going to be doing a little bit of country woodworking to build a project that I call the firewood sawhorse. It's basically just a low, sturdy bench. The materials come from the firewood pile. You get a couple of years out of them, and when you're done you throw it back on the pile and build another one. It's a really simple and straightforward project, but it does illustrate all the principles that you're going to need to understand this form of woodworking. So here it is in its simplest form. It's basically just 4 sticks jabbed into a log. It may surprise you to find out that the only difference between this bench and a Windsor chair is the level of finish of the parts. The mechanics of what holds them together is exactly the same. You'll notice all the wood that I'm working with today has some red paint on the ends. That's because this wood came from a dead standing tree that was in my dad's yard. At the time I wasn't really too sure what I wanted to do with the wood, so I painted the ends to keep them from checking. Normally this type of woodworking is done with green wood. The piece is totally completed and then allowed to dry. The drying process is actually what gives the piece its strength, so even though you could build something like a chair in a day, you really can't go ahead and use it until it seasons and all the parts shrink together. This bench, however, is a totally different matter. I'm going to be putting it together with a tapered leg joint. This type of joint naturally gets driven tighter and tighter as you use the bench. So I can build this out of any kind of wood that I want. It can be all dry wood, all green, or a mixture of dry and green wood. It doesn't really matter because the legs are constantly being driven up into the bench. I usually start working on the top of the bench first. I'll work on both sides of the board until I decide which surface is going to be the top. And then I'll concentrate on that face and try to make it as flat as I can. These benches usually get used as portable chopping blocks, so they get chewed up pretty fast, so there's not really any point in getting too crazy with this process. I'm just looking for a reasonably flat surface. Now I'm ready to drill the holes for the legs. I usually drill the holes from the underside of the bench. I'll start the hole at the very edge of the bench, and then I'll tip the auger over slightly to match the splay of the legs that I want. I don't use any gauges to measure this angle. I just keep my head centered over the board, and that allows me to estimate how much I'm tipping the auger on each side. As long as you have the angle fairly close, you're going to have a usable bench. It's a pretty shallow angle. You're really not looking for the legs to spread out that far beyond the edges of the bench. The final step to shaping the top is to size the holes using a tapered auger. Now that the top is complete, I'll start working on the legs. At this point I'm just doing some preliminary shaping on the legs. I'm just trying to square them up, get rid of any large tapers or irregularities that are going to be harder to deal with later on at the shaving horse. I'm making sure to leave the legs just a little bit oversized. I want to make sure that I have enough material to shave down the tapered leg joint that's going to fit the legs to the top. The first step in shaping the leg joint is to shave the block down to match the large end of the tapered hole in the top. So for example, if the large end of the tapered hole is 2 inches in diameter, then you want to shave the top end of the leg down to 2 inches square. Now again, I'm using fairly dry wood here, so I'm working a little harder than I would be if the wood was green. Shaving horses work best with green wood. The only reason I'm getting away with removing this much material here is because I'm using a fairly soft wood. If I was using a dry maple or an oak, I wouldn't be able to remove this much material very easily with the shaving horse. I'd have to do a lot more chopping and a lot more prep work . before doing the final shaping on the shaving horse. I'm using a pencil to mark the sides of the blank that have the edge grain. I'm going to need to keep track of that later on when I'm assembling the bench. This wood has a very light, nondescript grain, so I just find it easier to mark the blank than to be continually double checking the piece to make sure that you have the leg in the right orientation. The next step is to shape the very ends of the legs until they match the small end of the tapered hole at the top of the bench. Now it's just a matter of establishing the right angle for the taper. I'm being very careful not to remove any more material off the very tip of the leg that's already been sized. I'm just going to be shaving the sides of the leg into a longer and longer taper until it matches the hole in the top. Even though this is just a crude workbench and not a Windsor chair, it's still important to take your time during this operation. The fit of this tapered leg into the top is going to determine how sturdy your bench is going to be. Also, a poorly fitting joint might cause one or more of the legs to drop out of the top every time you move the bench. I've highlighted the grain here so it's clearly visible. You want the grain for the legs to be at right angles to the grain of the top. And that's because the dimension of the leg isn't really going to change much in this direction. All the expansion and contraction is going to be happening across the growth ring. So as the wood in the leg expands and contracts with humidity, it's going to be applying all of the pressure against the end grain of the top. If I had the leg turned the other way, it is possible for the leg to apply enough pressure to split the top. Now all you have to do is drive the legs into the top. Once the legs are driven in, you cut off whatever's sticking out of the top and you're done. There's no glue or fasteners holding this bench together, it's just the tapered leg joint driven tight into the top. Again, this is about as simple as it gets.